Before I continue, this video will contain spoilers for Delicious in Dungeon, or Dungeon Meshi. This includes the manga and or the anime. Consider yourself warned.
Baby, don't you know it? I'm hardly heroic. Baby, let's roll it, 'cause I'm hardly heroic.
Hello everyone, welcome to Hardly Heroic. If you're looking at the screen and you recognize what's being displayed, then you can probably tell that this is going to be another Dungeon Meshi, or Delicious in Dungeon, video. Based on the popular demand of my last video about Dungeon Meshi, and the fact that I do have a commenter, whose name escapes me at the moment, but they've been talking about me talking about the living armor for quite a while, so I thought I would put together a short video discussing the living armor from Dungeon Meshi. Now, this is not meant to be a completely comprehensive review. I just want to go through the living armor as it's depicted in the anime, primarily, and just talk about some things that I think are very interesting, and also some things that stand out to me. So I'm going to be talking about the basic living armor suit that is sort of depicted, and then also the quote-unquote elite one that you also see in the course of the video. And to briefly talk about my own background and why I think I am talking about this. Well, I have a background in historical European martial arts. I have been a practitioner and instructor for many years at a club in my country. And primarily when people think of HEMA, I think they tend to think of the unarmored aspect, the unarmored fencing aspect of it. This is, I think, by and large, probably the predominant form of HEMA, where in a fight between two people in a HEMA context, you are basically aiming to replicate a unarmored duel scenario or something similar. Basically, in the context of those fights, your your participants are treated as if they're not wearing any protective equipment. Generally speaking, most fencers will wear some protective equipment, if nothing else, just a helmet to protect their head. And even though they've got protective equipment, any hit that they take is assumed to be a more serious hit, a more crippling or disabling strike. Now, even though that is the predominant form, I would say, of HEMA, that's not the end of it, right? The other part of HEMA, of course, is armored fencing. Traditionally, it's called harness fectin. Basically, it involves fencing in a context where you're wearing full or almost entirely full plate armor, or generally speaking, some kind of armor, and the armor is treated as it actually is. So in unarmored fencing, you might be wearing, for example, gauntlets to protect your hands. And in that normal fencing context, if you get hit in the hand, it still gets counted as a hit, even though you're wearing those gauntlets. But in a harness fectin context, then if you're wearing that kind of gauntlet to protect your hand, then for the most part, your hand is treated as being protected from actual strikes and things like that. As a result, when you're fencing in armor, the calculus about how you do it changes quite significantly, and also if you're facing an armored opponent. And of course, all of this is relevant to say because living armor, I think, is a very interesting concept in fantasy, and I do like the approach that Dungeon Meshi does with its living armor, which I will get into in a moment. But I think it's important to state that armored fencing and unarmored fencing are related subjects, but they have a significant amount of differences. So when we think about things that might be relevant for dealing with, say, for example, a very heavily armored opponent, that kind of stuff doesn't apply to less armored opponents. Now, all that being said, having watched and read all of Dungeon Meshi, or at least watched all that was available at the time of recording, I do have to say that I think my opinion about Dungeon Meshi has changed a little bit. Specifically, I had this idea at the beginning of my view time of Dungeon Meshi that it was, generally speaking, a very comprehensive kind of grounded look at, adventuring, right? A lot of adventuring typically doesn't feature or really focus on the actual logistics of keeping yourself alive. Now remember, for every one guy that manages to live and die by the sword, there are at least 10 more who have died of dysentery. Right, so the idea that you have to focus on how people might actually stay alive while they're dungeoneering, that I think is a very interesting complication. And generally speaking, I think Dungeon Meshi is very good when it's focusing on that aspect of the adventuring, right? Scavenging for food, materials, ingredients, making it actually. I've always found that to be a particularly enjoyable part of both the anime and the manga, just to see what they will come up with, over the course of the story. But that being said, the more I think about it, the more I really think that the focus of this anime really is heavily skewed against fighting, really, of any kind, right? And my opinion is basically formulated on the fact that things like armor and weaponry are kind of detached in terms of their function and applicability to the scenario, right? Laios wears a lot of armor. He wears more armor than, generally speaking, you might see a lot of characters wear in these particular kinds of scenarios, but that never really affords him a level of protection that might actually be, sort of worth it, right? And there are a couple of reasons for this. I think one important reason is that, generally speaking, a lot of the monsters in the dungeon bypass armor entirely. It doesn't really matter if you're wearing a steel cuirass if, for example, you get hit by a creature like a griffin. The force of that strike will cave in that armor regardless of what material it's made out of, right? Other types of creatures bypass armor entirely. Various types of poisons, various types of plants and things like that. The most you really see armor actually get used in the context of the story is when Laios uses a helmet, essentially his helmet, to mitigate somewhat the effects of a stinging venomous plant. It doesn't protect him entirely, but it does mitigate the effects. So, armor really doesn't really do it doesn't serve its function, is what I'm trying to get at, right? When we think of armor, especially when I think of armor, I always think of something that's principally there to protect you. And for the most part, armor is very effective. It wasn't effective, it wouldn't have been worn, right? Which is why in periods where various types of weapons can more easily defeat armor tends to be entirely discarded or only worn in very particular circumstances. Like, for example, in the Napoleonic War, black powder muskets are so effective at dealing damage at range that there really isn't any kind of protective armor that you can reliably provide to soldiers to protect them. Instead, they just have to accept the risk of being shot and whatever commensurate damage that might entail. And whenever you do see armor, it's always in a very limited context, such as, for example, Napoleonic cuirassiers. So, armor in Dungeon Meshi doesn't really serve a function of armor. In some ways, you might actually think about it like a costume, right? You have a lot of characters in the story that, in theory, would want to have armor to protect themselves, if only just for the fact that there are many things in a dungeon that could potentially hurt them and disable them or make their life difficult that they could otherwise avoid with armor. Marcel, for example, wears sandals, and that is a far cry from something that I would think he would want to wear in a dungeon where, generally speaking, if your foot gets hurt, your ability to run is significantly diminished, and that might affect your actual mobility and so on and so forth. So you would think that she wouldn't be wearing sandals, she would wear some kind of boot, but that's not really true. Even basic amounts of protection might actually mitigate some of the potential dangers of being in a dungeon, but only one character actually wears a helmet, and that's our dwarf friend, Senshi. So it isn't really an anime or a manga series where fighting is the focus, right? It's not something where you should necessarily think of the weapons and armor and things like that of the characters as serving really a very grounded practical function. In a lot of cases, it's just there for set dressing. And that I think is fine, right? It's not exactly what I thought it was going to be, but it is also true to itself. If you're looking for an anime that is very much about cooking and very much about camaraderie and sort of personal storytelling, then Dungeon Meshi, I think, will hit every mark. But it will sort of have some weirder areas where I definitely look at the situation and think, yeah, maybe it would behoove them to have a more personal protection, or to treat that personal protection as something more serious. Notably, whenever there are fights between human level characters, it doesn't really seem to do much really there either, right? In terms of the level of protection that a character might want to have or might want to wear. You know, Laios gets his legs hurt, and then he just doesn't wear his Polians for the rest of the story, right? That I think is strange. Why wouldn't he just put them back on, you know? It doesn't really matter, you know, because his armor is not armor in a protective sense, it's a costume, right? It's there to delineate him from other characters, to sort of indicate something about his character, and so on and so forth. So, that's a lot of preamble, basically to get to the point that I wanted to, which is that I think the living armor is a strange addition, I think, to the Dungeon Meshi canon, because living armor is highly detailed, highly realistic looking armor, but it also kind of falls into this weird zone where stuff in Dungeon Meshi doesn't necessarily look like it should, right? And just looking at a depiction of the living armor, you can see that it's a fairly effective rendition of 15th or 16th century plate armor, right? I made a comment the last time that Laios doesn't really have folds, and that maybe it wouldn't necessarily be the best idea to not have any kind of additional protection, you know, besides a coat of mail. Okay, so I wanted to talk about, you know, the armor, and maybe try and provide a bit more of a detailed examination of it. So I've switched to Paint just so that we can, you know, just so that I can annotate this like I'm John Madden. Yeah, so as I said, the armor is attached, you know, quite effectively. We have basically a bunch of important details here. The folds of the armor, the folds of the armor are attached to the tassets, which are over here, and these are basically, you know, very important for protecting you. A lot of the times in a lot of media that you see, that armor is more to the side when it really should be closer to the front of the leg. I don't know where that started, where they would move the tasset to the side of the leg, but it really should be protecting more in the front. What you don't see really are any kind of connection points or hinges that might attach these two elements together. But you do have the placard, which is this piece of armor here, and then the rest of the cuirass over there. So that is, in a lot of ways, almost entirely perfect. You know, in terms of, yeah, it's a little bit more stylistic, but it definitely does look a lot like armor. And you know, the leg armor is especially really, really nice. You can see all, you know, the elements you can see, for example, there's the Polian, there is the wing guard that protects the side of the leg, you've got the Kisus over there, the Greave, and then Sabatons, right? All of this is very comprehensive protection, and then if you look on the back, you can see that, you know, there are straps here for the knight to basically strap themselves into. And, you know, you can see that the character is, I think this is meant to be a coat of mail. So you can see that the armor system is quite comprehensive. That there is some kind of mail that would protect, you know, the lower, more vulnerable area, because to put a plate over there might be too cumbersome. What's something that I do want to draw your attention to is, of course, the asymmetrical pauldron over here. So you can see that the two pauldrons that are given to the knight are different. And we do have, you know, some examples of this in a documentary sense, where you don't necessarily want to have two pauldrons be the same if they're going to be doing different sorts of functions, right? You might have one pauldron that is much more maneuverable, less cumbersome, for an arm that needs to move a lot more, and then the other pauldron is more protected because you don't need to move that arm as much, right? If you, for example, imagine that this knight is right-handed, you can have a situation where the knight's lance is in their right hand and their shield is in their left hand, and if they were jousting, for example, they would potentially face more risk, you know, on that left side, so on and so forth. So you might have an asymmetrical pauldron. There are also fashion considerations, right? You can see that the knight is depicted here with plumage, right? And fashion is very important in a medieval context, and obviously in any kind of context, really. Armor is a statement not just as a protective function, but also as a social function, an artistic function, an aesthetic function. Tobias Capwell, who is the curator of the Wallace collection and a very noted practitioner and curator of arms and armor, he always says that it's difficult for the modern mind to imagine that something might have a aesthetic function and a practical function, that something can be both practical and aesthetically pleasing. I think, for the most part, this armor is very well put together. I think maybe something that's a bit sort of weird about it are the gauntlets, right? And I think maybe the helmet just looks a little bit strange to me. I think some of the elements of the proportions there are a little bit off. But of course, this is not armor for a person, right? One of the things that I've always found a little bit odd about the Dungeon Meshi universe is that nobody thinks about these kinds of suits of armor as being very valuable, right? You don't really see people going into the dungeon, fighting living armors, defeating them, and then just scooping up all the armor for resale, later back in the store. Even if you don't necessarily find an exact fit in terms of size, armor like this is incredibly valuable. The fact that you've got almost a full suit here, I still think it would be very valuable. I don't know necessarily if it would be economically feasible to go hunt living armors to capture their armor for resale, but certainly, if you told a bunch of armor enthusiasts today that all they'd have to do is defeat, a living armor, I bet you they would, absolutely jump at the chance to attack this thing and, get rid of it. The living armors don't necessarily pose. I mean, I guess the threat that they pose is highly dependent on your ability to respond, right? In the anime, we see them grapple. We see basically 3 people fight off a whole room full of living armors. Now, obviously, magic is a great way to deal with any sort of problem in any kind of universe, but in a practical sense, fighting off a living armor doesn't seem very easy, right? There is this implication at the beginning of that episode where they're featured that the living armors are necromantic in nature or controlled by magic, right? There's some wizard doing some magical shenanigans to, control this armor, and the actual reality of it is much more complicated. These living armors are not armor at all, actually. They are a cleverly disguised sort of mollusk-like organism. And basically, it's a colony of these organisms that inhabit the armor, and they join together to create some kind of like musculature that can maneuver the armor in some way, shape, or form. What I find interesting that's not necessarily talked about in the anime is that these creatures, in terms of their life cycle, create the armor. Right? This is not something that they find. This is not armor that they wear. They create it, kind of like a shell. And that means that the fact that they're able to recreate armor that looks like this is kind of a miraculous sort of thing if you think about it, right? Because it means that these creatures who don't have a high level of sentience are basically, through mimicry, emulating armor that possibly they might have access to, they might be able to find in a dungeon environment. And then they are basically producing this armor almost as a perfect replica. And I find that to be fascinating, right? These creatures are very, very basic, very simple creatures, but they are producing these things in such a complicated way as to look identical to real armor in a couple of ways. Now, when it comes to dealing with living armor, the party doesn't really deal with them. They basically get past them. Because in the context of the episode, it's kind of a mating season or spawning season for the living armors, and Laios basically finds an egg sac that was laid by one of them, and sends all the other armors away, for the most part, because they chase after it, right? Now, I think this is an interesting idea. I'm not necessarily sure if that would make a lot of sense, right? As to why creatures would probably expend a lot of their own energy, a lot of their own resources to make something like this. Like, it's not really discussed, but what do these living armors actually eat? Are they consuming adventurers? Are they eating metal? How do they sustain themselves? What exactly is their, internal ecosystem, in their internal life cycle, right? Because this is not biologically trivial to make, right? It's a full suit of armor. And for the most part, we see in the episode that it behaves like a full suit of armor. You can't stab through it effectively, because your attack will bounce off. I think this is a kind of a fascinating conundrum, right, as to how such a creature might evolve. And maybe, this could be an interesting sort of experiment, but if you go back further in the evolutionary timeline, maybe you might see them trying to emulate, maybe coats of mail or maybe scale armor or something like that. And then over time, if living armor colonies are allowed to propagate for a sufficient amount of time, maybe then and only then they are able to spawn things that look like plate armor. I think that's a fascinating question that, I'm sure you would get an answer to maybe if you asked somebody like Senshi or Laos about, the practicalities of it. But of course, that's just an open question. Now, I do want to... One reason why I talked about Harness Fectin at the beginning of this episode is to talk basically about ways that you would fight something like this. As it's revealed in the course of the episode, you can't obviously just stab through these things, and if you take off their various body parts, they can reattach them. That's not necessarily going to stop them. Now, I was thinking about this for a while, and I ultimately think that when it comes to dealing with living armors, if you don't have magic available in some kind of way that could easily stop them, like a very large fireball or water spell or something like that, I think just treating them as armor is, in some ways, just the right way to go, right? Treat this as an armored opponent. The living armors aren't shown to have a high degree or a high possession of martial skill. For the most part, they just seem to swing. They might have superior reflexes to some extent, maybe because the colony has a collective intelligence once it's all linked together into the suit. But they have vulnerabilities, right? If you take off their helmet, their perception is, more limited and stuff like that. But also, remember, there's no actual mass inside of the armor itself. There's no person inside there, to help give the armor the full rigidity that it actually, needs. So, in some sense, I think it might actually be easier to trip these living armor up. And, in an armored fighting context, once you're on the floor, that's when you're at your most vulnerable. So I think that in that particular context, that would also be something that you would have to think about. But, in terms of treating them as regular armored opponents, large pole weapons, things like pole axes, would, they'd still work, right? Because pole axes give you various different options for leveraging or attacking your opponent in ways that allow you to basically circumvent the fact that they're wearing so much plate armor, right? You can leverage various types of grapples and various types of holds and bring them down to the floor, where then you can finish them off. Well, in this particular case, against the living armor, you can grapple and leverage them in the same sorts of ways, presumably, and once they're on the floor, then you can maybe start to separate the pieces, and then maybe with some assistance, kill the actual pieces inside. I think that's something that would definitely be interesting to examine, right? The way that they're defeated, of course, is not really the same. But, once you've started to separate the pieces, the armor itself is very vulnerable, right? If you can fight it one-on-one, fighting living armor, I think, should be relatively easy. It's when they have a mass of them that's when that's more difficult, right? Because, as is shown in the anime, it is possible to basically disassemble one suit of living armor piece by piece until eventually you can get rid of the most important components. And once you've done that, killing the rest of it is quite easy. Now, I'm not sure if I would necessarily want to eat living armor. I mean, it looks like a mollusk, but I don't know exactly how that would taste. I do think that that presents a very interesting challenge. And it's certainly, it's very refreshing to see such attention to detail paid to ostensibly a suit of fantasy armor that's really only on screen for, most of one episode. Okay, so I also wanted to talk about the second suit of living armor that we see, because it's a much more ornamental piece in a bunch of different ways, and I thought it would just be a little bit more interesting to talk about as well. So firstly, just to get this out of the way, we can see the big egg sac. We can see the big egg sac that the living armors are actually interested in. That sac over there contains their, new spawn, and presumably it's the thing that they most want to defend. Now, why you would put that on the outside, I'm not sure. I think, if anything, it might be better protected on the inside of the breastplate, right? Why don't you move that into here? That might be, a very interesting question. I'm not sure why that might, why it's done this way. Obviously it gives them a vulnerability that can be exploited, because Laios throws the shield to distract all the living armor. But I do think that it's very vulnerable, right? In this particular area, right? And the fact that it's not on the inside of the breastplate, which is the most protected area of the armor, I think that's very strange. So this suit of armor looks a lot like Ornstein's suit of armor from Dark Souls 1. I haven't found any trivia to suggest that it was directly inspired by this, but if you know of something, please let me know. It just really does look a lot like Ornstein's armor, although there are some subtle differences. For example, you can see that this fellow is wearing, or at least the armor is shown with a kind of cloth component, right? A skirt. Historically speaking, these types of skirts are called bases, or bases. They are an example of Renaissance fashion that you see. Oftentimes knights, or more specifically gendarmes, in the Renaissance would wear heavy suits of plate armor, and these would be quite well made and quite protective, but oftentimes you'd see them wearing these elaborate skirts. And, there are potential, many potential reasons for this, from things like fashion to comfort. Obviously, this is a living armor. This thing is made up of mollusks on the inside. It's not as if they need to have like comfort or anything like that. So I'm guessing that in this particular case, it's just an aesthetic thing that is developed, right? Maybe this is inspired by the mollusks witnessing another suit of armor that might have been worn by a person. This is a much more ornamental suit for a bunch of different reasons. Firstly, it looks like it's made out of gilt metal, or perhaps maybe gold or some other kind of metal. It's difficult to say whether or not this might be in a ceremonial armor, right? Ceremonial armor is a thing. It was often used in a medieval context, because armor is, remember, not only purely practical, it also serves aesthetic and cultural purposes as well. If you're a king and you're on parade, you want to look imposing, regal, perhaps even larger than life. And wearing a suit of armor that makes you look like that is a great way of encouraging that in your populace, basically. Now, this armor is very much more ornamental than the other, and I don't know necessarily if that means it's ceremonial or if it's just simply more ornamental, right? It is possible for example, if this is just steel that is then gilt metal, it would be expensive, but it would still be functional as a suit of armor, right? But if it was, for example, say made out of gold, then that would change the protective quality of the armor and also make it quite a bit heavy, I think. It highly depends on whether or not this is actually ornamental or whether or not it's just something that's been made to be more ostentatious than maybe a regular suit of armor. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Again, you also see asymmetrical pauldrons. So on this side, you have a pauldron with a guard on the top. That function there, that additional plate is for deflection, especially in a jousting context. You don't want a lance to strike your face, so maybe if you get hit in the shoulder, you don't want maybe it to bounce up, so you have an additional protection there. The other shoulder has a giant wing. I'm not sure what that's necessarily a reference to. If anybody can comment below. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on Dungeon Meshi or anything like that. I find it interesting, but I don't necessarily know everything about it, and the wiki is not necessarily super helpful in that case as well. But for the rest of the armor, it is basically practical. One thing that I think is very interesting about this is that you see the tassets are made up of these big, long laminated parts, right? Lots of lames, right? That's what each individual thing is. You don't see the rivets that might connect something like this together, but you do see that these tassets are connected to the breastplate, basically with straps, which you didn't see on the other armor, which I find interesting. But on the back there, you get a confirmation that there is in fact a fold. Although I think actually that the first lame, this part here, that is the fold, and the rest is connected. I think this is potentially quite an interesting looking addition. Generally speaking, these long tassets that go all the way down to the knee is something that's more associated with stuff like cuirassiers and sort of later period armor. Generally speaking, in the Middle Ages, you would wear a cuisse, which is that protection for your thigh, and then maybe have a smaller tasset that just sort of overlaps the top, or basically where the leg meets the hip, or the pelvis. So that I think is interesting. It also looks like the gauntlets are maybe a little bit more detailed. and they fit the hand a lot more closely, which I think is maybe a better sign. So yeah, this armor looks a lot more fancy. And I do like the look of it. Right, certainly, you know, the lion helm, or animal helm, is imposing. I don't know necessarily how much vision you'd be able to get out of that. I feel like you'd have to have it very closely tailored to your head in order for the vision to, you know, necessarily be effective. Unless you're meant to look out of the mouth, right? Unless the purpose of this armor is that the eyes are actually illusory and you're maybe meant to look out of the mouth. It's a bit difficult to tell, actually. You know, one thing that we don't really see depicted on this armor is a gorget, right? There's no... I mean, this helmet is quite protective, so there's like a bit of overlap, but because that's metallic, I'm not sure if that would necessarily flex so well. You don't really see any protection for the neck, which could be a vulnerable area, but, you know, as I discussed previously, this is not a real armor suit for a real person to fight in. It's a shell. It's a shell, a protective shell, like a hermit crab shell for a colony of mollusks. I do think it's interesting that nobody even thinks about taking the armor, like in the context of adventuring, right? Nobody thinks, oh, we've just killed these creatures, you know, maybe we should take some of the armor. I'm of two minds of this. On the one hand, you know, armor is very heavy, so carrying stuff that you don't necessarily need is not to your detriment. I mean, it's not to your favor, right? Especially in a dungeon where your supplies and space are very limited. I think this armor is fancy enough that maybe it might fetch for quite a price. Yeah, I think it's interesting that, you know, it's pretty much discarded, you know, as soon as the people are done eating the mollusks, you know, on the inside. And yeah, I'd love to know a bit more about the story of this particular armor. Like, did the mollusks see this somewhere and were inspired to make it? Is it perhaps maybe a sign of aging, right? If your colony is able to survive as a suit of armor for long enough, do they instead start to grow ornamentations, right? Maybe that would be very interesting. Maybe it's actually a sign of like the evolutionary fitness of your colony of mollusks that, oh, look at you, you're so good that you've survived long enough for your armor to become ornamented, right? I could see that being certainly some kind of like evolutionary signal to other colonies of living armor that, hey, that guy over there, that guy's, you know, a really, really good quality living armor. You know, so that it could also be a product of like maybe evolutionary design to protect the nest, right? Where the most protective armor system that can be made basically is made for the purposes of protecting the nest. In the same way that, you know, there are specialized ants that protect the nest from, you know, other potential threats, whereas most of the ants are worker ants. You know, that could be it as well. Anyway, I think that is more or less everything that I've wanted to say about the living armor. I find them very fascinating. I think they're really well done. Unfortunately, I really just don't think that they're utilized very well in the context of the story. I think, like every monster in Delicious and Dungeon, it's there to serve as a meal, as ingredients for, you know, the next interesting meal that they're going to sort of happen upon. And, you know, I would have liked to see more done with this kind of concept, but I also understand why that isn't the case, right? As I said at the beginning of this video, living armor is an example of the fact that Delicious and Dungeon is not about fighting, it's not about armor, it's not about weapons or anything like that, really. It's about friendship and food. And, you know, sometimes the intersection of the two. So, thank you everyone for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this impromptu video. You know, let me know what you think in the comments below. And the one commenter who had requested living armor, well, there you go. I hope you're happy. It just goes to show that if you're persistent enough about something, eventually I will get around to talking about it. You know, let me know if you have any more ideas for things that you'd like me to talk about. Until then, take care and goodbye, everybody. And also, remember to like and subscribe.